Good morning, everyone. My name is Rich Sloma. Welcome to the New York State Archives webinar, Quality Control and Verification of Digital Imaging. Today's presenter is David Lowry. David is the New York State Archives Head of Local Government Advisory Services. Please note this webinar is being recorded. We will ask you to type any questions that you have in the chat box below, and we will take them at the end of this presentation. And at this point in time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dave.
Okay, good morning, everybody, on this cold, snowy morning here in New York State. I hope everybody's doing well. So today, before we start talking about quality control and verification for digital images, I just would like to remind everybody, many of you are aware of this, but some still may not be aware of this. Last August, the New York State Archives released a new retention schedule for local government records. And what we did is we consolidated the four old schedules, that would be the MU1, the CO2, the ED1, and the MI1, into this one new schedule, the LGS1. Well, on January the 1st, 2021, all four of those have expired, okay? So if you've not adopted this new LGS1 schedule, you cannot dispose of any records until you have done so, because those four schedules no longer have any legal authority. So if you have not done that, please do that as quickly as possible. If you need a sample resolution, there is one in the front of, in the introductory section of the LGS1. Okay, so now that I got that out of the way, let's just launch into our presentation and what we're going to do today. So our agenda here is quite simple. We're going to look at the who, what, why, when, and how of verification and quality control of digital images. So who should do it? Okay, very important question. Then what exactly is it? We'll define that for you. We'll let you know exactly what we mean by verification and quality control. And are they exactly the same thing? Here's the big question. Why, right? You're all going to know why, okay? State Archives wants me to do this. Sounds like it's a lot of work. It's going to take time. Sounds rather tedious, too. So why should I do it? When should you do it? And then finally, of course, is how do you do it? Okay, so one of our first questions is why. So why this training? Well, a little over a year ago, back in 2019, we updated our digital imaging guidelines. Didn't make a lot of changes. But what the new guidelines did was it clarified when 100% verification should be done. And I'll define that for you in a little while, what we mean by 100% verification, okay? And finally, the last reason, which is a really good one, is the Archives has never provided training on quality control or verification for digital images. We've told you for years you need to do this, and it dawned on us, it's like, well, we've never actually had any formal training on this. So what this webinar does is it starts to rectify that problem and start giving you some kind of training on how you should do this. So some of you, no doubt, have probably been through an imaging project. And if you have, you know there are various stages to it, right? So an imaging project is not just taking, a bunch of records, slapping them on the scanner into the automatic document feeder, and hitting go, right? There's a lot more to it than that. You have to prepare the documents, then you do the scanning, and you have to index them, right? Because you need to find them once you scan them, and then verification and quality control. Now, oftentimes people do a pretty good job on the first three, but it's the verification and quality control. When they get to that, oftentimes people let that slip, or they don't do it at all. So let's just take a quick run through here. of those various parts of an imaging project. So say you have a project that's going to take you 10.5 hours, so 10.5 hours to complete. So the first part you would do, of course, is your document prep. That means you would, get your records, put everything in the order you want them scanned in, make sure everything's facing the right way around, right? Make sure some of them aren't upside down. Then remove all those fasteners, so staples, paper clips, rubber bands, which you should never use, but if you do have rubber bands on your record, obviously you need to remove those things, flatten them out. And so that would take about an hour for a 10.5 hour project, or you could see here about 9%. So the next part, which we're calling image capture, and image capture really is just a fancy way of us saying the scanning part, okay? So that is, when you take either your paper, your microfilm records, and you scan them, all right? You just run them through, and they're all digitized. So what does this mean here? Rated capacity versus throughput. Well, that's referring to the scanner you're using. Now, all scanners have a rated capacity. So that rated capacity might be, say, 1,000 pages per hour. Okay, but that's under ideal circumstances. Then there is actual throughput, really what you can actually do in an hour. And so in this case, maybe it might actually only be 750 or 800 pages per hour, because there really is no such thing as an ideal situation, right? Little things are going to go wrong, little things are going to slow you down. So your chances of actually scanning up to that rated capacity of 1,000 per hour is actually pretty low. So that is the image capture or scanning part. And then the really important part here is ensuring a quality product, right? You wanted to make sure that you adhere to all the imaging standards. It's best really to do this not long after the scanning. Sometimes you can't do it immediately after the scanning, especially if you're using a vendor, right? That really doesn't work. Usually the problems you have in the scanning process are caused by mechanical problems. And then finally, there is the content verification, where you need to verify that every single record that you scanned was actually scanned. And so what that means is comparing the digital image to the original record and going through page by page and making sure that everything was done. Now you could see here, this takes considerably longer than the first two parts, right? The first part, the prep, was an hour. The second part, the actual scanning, was an hour and a half. This part's going to take you 3.5 hours, right? So a long time. So this is a big chunk of your project. Now you can see here the biggest chunk, which we're not going to go over today, is what we call the indexing and access part. So that means having to index all the images, again, because you need to find them once they're indexed, creating a file structure for them, and finally uploading them, or often what we call ingesting them, say, into some sort of a content management system, which then is going to be your access tool for these records. So let's take a look at quality control and verification. Are they the same thing? They're very similar, and you're, obviously going to do them together, but there's technically a little bit of a difference between the two of them. So quality control, as you can see here, is reviewing scanned images with the human eye to ensure that the images are of acceptable quality and meet all technical specifications, okay? So that's just looking at a particular image and saying, yes, this looks like a good, sharp image, a true copy of the original paper record. Verification, as you can see, here's a process of checking the scanned images against the original record, so whether, say, it's paper or microfilm, to ensure each page of each document was scanned. So here's the thing, as you're doing verification, you're going to be doing the quality control at the same time. But just to let you know, there is a little bit of a technical difference between the two of them. So what do you want to verify? Okay, again, I said at the beginning, the why question is really important because before you do something, before you take this undertaking, you want to know why it's important. So you want to ensure a quality product. So say you just paid a vendor, say $40,000 to scan a bunch of records, you're going to want to make sure that vendor did a good job, okay? You want to ensure access to vital and important records. Now, if you're scanning these records, obviously they're very important to you. You need them to do your day-to-day work. You need them to serve the public that you're serving. And so you want to make sure that everything was scanned and it's readable. Also very important, you want to meet those retention policies. Say you have just scanned your payroll records. As many of you know, a payroll record's got a very long retention period, 55 years. Okay, so you don't want to take an important record like that and then scan them, destroy the original images, and then find out that, you know, a bunch of them are blurry, you can't read them, maybe some of them never got scanned at all, and now the records are gone. And in the end, that's going to hurt somebody. So that gets to our last point, which is to ensure liability protection. Okay, you may need these records, say, to protect yourself during a lawsuit. If you can't produce them, you lose that lawsuit. If it's a $2 million lawsuit, now you, or maybe your insurance company, are out $2 million. Same thing, we all have to deal with FOIL, right? Without Freedom of Information Law and those requests that come in. You have to be able to produce those records when you get that FOIL request. But here's the big thing to remember. Okay, you cannot allow the vendor to verify the images for you. Okay, obviously he's not going to do as good a job as you would do. And these are your records. Ultimately, you are the one who is responsible for maintaining these records and making sure they meet their legal retention requirements and that they are accessible to all those who need access to those records, oftentimes including the public. So who will scan? So this is going to, affect how you actually conduct your verification. So will a vendor scan or will you scan in-house? And different governments do this different ways. Some governments do have in-house scanning set up. They've got, workers that they've hired full-time to do this. And sometimes you're just going to want to send it out to a vendor. Especially when you're first starting, you've got a big backlog of records going back maybe 20, 30, 40 years that you need to handle. You're probably not going to want to try to do that in-house. You're going to send them out to a vendor, to a professional who's going to scan them and send them back to you. So let's take a look at the updated guidelines. So, excuse me. This is what the guidelines looked like before we updated them. So these were our sections on quality assurance and content verification. So you see here it says quality assurance must be conducted before the destruction of any original documents. Each image of every page of all digitized documents must be visually inspected, not verified by a machine. So again, that's a quality control, just looking at the images, making sure you've got a good image, readable image, true copy of the original. Okay. Now, this was section 23.10, content verification. The state agency or local government must conduct a page-by-page verification of 100% of the records to ensure that each page has been imaged. But you notice here, one thing it didn't say. It never talked about the original documents, whether they were being destroyed or not destroyed. So we just kept erring on the side of caution by telling people always do 100% verification. So what we've done, what the update is we've clarified this and said, hey, if you're not destroying the original documents, okay, you do not need to do 100% verification. And what we've done is given people some options to use sampling methods instead, which are much faster and easier to do. So here are the sampling methods. So Again, so if you are destroying the original records, so you're going to destroy those payroll records we were talking about, then you must perform 100% verification, okay? And especially if it's permanent, you definitely want to do this. So yes, that does mean what it sounds like. You need to sit in front of your computer with the original records, go page by page, and verify that everything was actually imaged. And at the same time, too, you're going to be looking at the quality of the image. But if you're going to keep the originals, okay, and oftentimes people do decide to keep the original as a backup to the system, right? Something happens to their images, you know, they at least have those original records to go back to. So then you could use one of two sampling methods. Now, one is the ANSI AIM TR34 sampling method. This is a very complex statistical methods used to create sample sizes. And I'm going to go over this in more detail. But you may be asking yourself, what does ANSI AIM mean? Well, ANSI is the American National Standards Institute, and they adopted a standard set by AIM. Now, AIM is a private organization, it's a professional organization. It's the Association of Information and Image Management, okay? And they created these standards back in 1996. And I did double check, these have not been updated since. They are still in effect from 1996. Now, here's one thing about the ANSI AIM standards. Not only are they a bit complex, but also you do have to purchase them. You can purchase them through AIM for only $52, so it's not a huge amount of money, but you still need to purchase them before using them. But the New York State Archives has also developed a sampling method, which of course is 100% free and fairly easy to use once you get the grasp of it. So let's start taking a look at these two methods and how they work. Okay, so how to verify. So whether you're doing 100% verification or sampling, here's something very important to do. Do it in batches. Do not wait to the end of your project. And I'm going to give you a little example why this is not a good idea. So this could pose some issues if you're using a vendor. You will need to set up a system with that vendor about getting, say, weekly batches to you so that you could start the verification process. And why do you want to do it in batches? Well, first of all, as I'll demonstrate, it's going to be much easier in the long run to do it in batches as you go along through the project. It's also going to ensure that your vendor has time to do some rescanning if necessary, right? So if you are doing this project and at the end you've got months and months of verification to do, and say maybe you started a little late, you start to develop problems, you go back to the vendor and say, hey, you need to make some corrections. He may say, well, take a look at your contract. You're past the contract period for doing rescans and correcting problems. Sorry. And so then you have to worry about doing that yourself. And in the end, it will prove more accurate. So let me give you that example I was talking about. Ask the question here too. Would you want to do this job? So let's just say there's a county out there. They scan 430,000 images, say in, I don't know, a 7 or 8 month period. So if you're going to wait till the end to verify and quality control all those images, you could see here, it would take you 7 hours a day, so a basic standard work day with an hour lunch, right, for 40 weeks, which, if you calculate that out, that's actually about 10 months to verify each image. So imagine sitting in front of a computer 7 hours a day for 10 straight months doing this. You'd probably start to go a little bonkers at some point doing that. And there's some things you really need to consider. Eye fatigue is a big one, right? If you're sitting in front of a computer, we all know this for hours on end, you start to get some bad eye fatigue, you need to take breaks. A sustained concentration level. It's going to be really hard, especially since this is not the most interesting and engaging work, right, for hour after hour to be able to concentrate at a level to make sure that you're doing this correctly, you're not going to miss something. And if you're doing this for too long, after a while your concentration level will naturally slip and you're going to start to miss things. And then, of course, there's just taking in that, human factor that just sheer boredom is going to set in at some point. So here are some helpful tips. Again, and to really stress this, verifying small batches. Okay. Now, who's ever doing the verification should take fairly frequent breaks, maybe, after every hour, take a 5, maybe a 10-minute break, get up, stretch your legs, get away from the computer before going back to it. And allow clerks who verify to work on other assignments throughout the day. So you might, tell the clerk who's working on this, hey, for the first hour or two this morning, you're going to do verification, then we're going to have you go work on another project for a couple of hours. In the early afternoon, you'll come back to this, etc. You get the point here of how this would work. And again, if you do this in the long run, you're just going to get a better quality product. You're going to, catch a lot of these mistakes that otherwise you may not catch. So, how do these sampling methods differ? So, the ANSI-AIM method uses a very complex statistical method to calculate a sample size and error rates. And I'm going to show you an example of this in a moment. And some have even been known to use this as a replacement for 100% verification. They feel it works so well, they feel comfortable. Right now, our guidelines do say you still need to do 100% verification, but who knows, that could change in the future. Now, also what it does, okay, this ANSI-AIM method, is it breaks down errors into 2 categories, which I think is a great idea. So you've got what's called a Class A error. Now, a Class A error is, you could say, a really bad error. That means there's a loss of information on the page. So maybe it is so blurry you can't read it. Perhaps a section of the page got cut off and didn't get scanned. Perhaps it's way too dark, something like that where you really can't read it. That's a Class A error, right? So it's almost as if it had never been scanned in the first place, right? It's that bad. A Class B errors means you get, your quality there is subpar, maybe it's slightly blurry, but there's no loss of information. Maybe the page is a little bit on the dark side, but you can still read it okay. So obviously what that tells us too is you can accept a higher error rate for a Class B error. Okay, and if you're getting a little confused by this, don't worry, I'm going to give you some examples of how this works in a moment. But I just wanted to show you this. Now, if you were to use the ANSI-AIM method of sampling, obviously you don't need to know these calculations, but I just thought it was a good idea to show you really, like I said, the very complex calculations that go into figuring out things like the sample size, the error rate, stuff like that. Again, this looks like something some, genius scientist uses on his board. My joke is it always looks like something only Sheldon Cooper from the Big Bang Theory can understand. And if you don't know who Sheldon Cooper is, you really should watch the Big Bang Theory. It's a very funny show. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples then of the Class A and Class B errors I was talking about. So you can see here, I'm not going to go over all of these, obviously, just to give you some examples. The second one here, which is a Class B error, which is adequate brightness. Okay, this is sometimes that's could be more of a monitor problem. That's a Class B error. We've probably all seen this one, right? The image is skewed on the page. That's a Class B error. Now, nowadays, a lot of the scanners and softwares have something called de-skewing. So if it does skew, usually it automatically will correct that. So skewing is not as much of a problem today as it used to be. The orientation is wrong on the page. That's usually fairly easy to fix, though, right? But you've got some Class A errors to look at here, right? So character dropout. So there's a missing character, so you can't read the word. right? Because you can't read one of the characters or characters. Legibility is small characters or features, missing portion at the edge of an image, something like that. That's a Class A error when there's been a loss of information. So first is determine the sample size. Now you can see here on the left, this would be how many images are in that actual batch. So I'm going to run through an example here. So say we have 2,800 images that were scanned by a vendor, and we're going to use the sampling method. So we got 2,800 images. So we look down and we say, well, 2,800 would fall into this fourth line here, which is between 1,201 and 3,200, and that is K. What exactly does K mean? Well, we're going to look on our little handy-dandy chart it gives us. And if you're in the K range, that means your sample size should be 125. So you're going to go through there and look at 125 images. Now, then you have to look at the rest of the chart. So what are these numbers going across at the top? These essentially are error rates. So you can have an extremely low error rate of, 0.010, which is very low, all the way up to 10%, okay, which is getting on the high side. Now, what you're going to do here is, of course, decide what error rate you want to accept. Now, when you're looking at Class A and Class B errors, obviously you want a lower error rate, probably significantly lower for A errors than you want for B errors. B errors, you might want to accept a higher rate. And again, this all is going to go to how much risk and liability you want to accept. You may think that the 0.01 is just unreasonably small. You're going to go with something higher, and that's fine. So say you want to go with a full 1%. You're fine with a 1% error rate. So then how does this work? So for K, let's say if we're going to do a 1% error rate, I hope you can all see this on your screens okay. It comes out nice on mine, so I'm assuming it's coming out okay on yours. So you see it's got these two numbers here. If you go down, you look, a 3 and a 4. Well, the AC means accept, so it means if you have 3 errors or fewer, you can accept that batch of 2,800. If you've hit 4, you should reject the whole batch. That's how that works. And again, if you're going to go smaller, like you can see how very small the 0.01 is, that means you can't accept any errors, okay? And even if there's one error, you would just simply reject the whole batch. Now you can see here the arrows point down. This is such a small error rate that there's only going to be one, whether you're doing a sample size of 2 or 2,000. And you can see here then there is much more leeway, say, when you get up to the 10% part. So, not too complicated to figure that out. So here's just an example. So if you were going to look, again, we'll do M. You can see M here is in this peachy orange kind of color here. So this is a sample size for weekly quality control compared to the blue, which is a sample size, say, for daily quality control, right? So weekly, you're obviously going to have more images, so it's going to be a bigger sample size. So we'll go with the weekly one, because that sounds pretty reasonable. So you're going to choose a Class A acceptance level for weekly quality control. And you can see here, you're going to go with 0.1, okay? So you can accept it if it has, you can accept it if it has 1, and you'll have to reject it if it has 2. So again, pretty low there. But for Class B, you're going to go with a full 1%, which means then you can accept up to 7 errors for the Class B, but you should still reject if you hit 8, because then what's happening at that point since this is just a sample you've taken of these 315 out of how many thousands of images, you're going to just have way too many subpar quality images. And again, if you've paid a vendor to do this, that's just too high, right? You're going to have to go back to the vendor and say, hey, you really just need to do this whole batch over. It's just too much of a mess. Or if the vendor wants to, he can go through and just correct whatever errors have been spotted. But it may just be easy at that point just to redo the entire batch. So here is the state archives method. As I said, there's not a lot of fancy statistical calculations going on here to figure this out. It's pretty straightforward. Now, when we run through these two slides, at first it might seem a little confusing because it's the first time you're hearing it. But once you follow through, you can see it's actually not too confusing, and it's pretty straightforward. So here's how it's going to work. So you're going to review the first 100 images in the batch. So say you got a batch of 2,000. So if the error rate is 3% or less, okay, then what you want to do is go and review every 25th image. So you're probably asking yourself, why not just review another batch of 100 or something like that, just to double check? Because here's the thing, you could, look at clusters of 100, the first 100, the second 100, the third 100. Oh, they look pretty good. I can accept this whole batch. But what if something started going wrong about the batch of the fifth 100 grouping? If something started going wrong, say with the scanner, you're never going to know that. So what you need to do then is just pop through and do some essentially spot checking. Okay, still sampling of every 25th image just to make sure. You can kind of see if new problems are popping up. So, and when we say every 25th image, it's like, well, that's an estimate. It could be 27, it could be 23, it could be a little different. But as long as you're doing some sort of just kind of random checking as you're going through, so about every 25 images would be fine. So then, if the errors appear more widespread when you're looking through that every 25th, then return to checking clusters of 100. So if the error rate exceeds 3% of those 100 again, then do another cluster of 100, okay? If that one also exceeds the error rate, now you know you got problems, right? So then at that point to say, I have to reject this whole batch, too many problems. If the next batch of 100 does not exceed the error rate, return to checking every 25th image, okay? If there are few errors on every 25th image, accept the whole batch. If frequent errors, then reject the whole batch. So again, you're judging for yourself, and this is leaving you a little bit of leeway. Now, what if you're saying to yourself, gee, Dave, I think 3% is a little bit too high. That's fine, lower it to 2%, lower it to 1%, whatever you feel comfortable with. Or, I wouldn't recommend going over 3%, but if you feel comfortable with that, you could maybe set it at 4. I wouldn't do that. And again, you might want to use those class A and B errors. So you may say okay, my class A errors, I don't want to go over 2%. That's going to be too much for me. But for class B errors, 3 or 4%, I'm fine with. Okay. And to continue, so if the error rate is over 3% on the first cluster, now last slide we said if it's under. So now, say you did that first cluster of 100 images, and it's actually over 3% right off the bat. Then what you want to do is then review another cluster of 100. If the error rate is still over 3%, review one more cluster. If still over 3%, then reject the whole batch. Again, that's just too much. If the error rate does not exceed 3% on the third cluster, then return to checking every 25th image and return to the method on the previous slide. And if the error rate on the second cluster of 100 was below 3%, at that rate, you can then return to every 25th image and follow the method on the previous slide. Now, like I said, in that first run through, you might be scratching your head a little bit and say, oof, but if you go over it a couple of times, it's fairly simple. And chances are, in most cases, because remember, the vendor is doing his own quality control. Generally, they don't do verification, but they do a lot of quality control. And you can probably feel pretty confident in most cases using your sampling method. You'll notice that, hey, this looks like a good scanning job, and I'm fine. And this really will take you a lot less time than doing 100% verification. Okay, I'm not going to read all of these to you, but you could just see here on the screen are the types of errors to look out for. Now, one thing I didn't touch on here, because we're trying to concentrate on the images, is also look at your filing name conventions. That means your indexing. Are you being consistent in your indexing terms and things like that? That's something else you're going to want to look for. Obviously, things like the correct size and resolution. So it was supposed to be done at 300 ppi, pixels per inch. Was it? Are you getting a clear image? Obvious little things like if the image is not skewed, it's neither too light or too dark, there's no distortion on it, appropriate contrast, things like that. And I'm going to show you, because some of you, I'm sure, are trying to picture this in your head. Look, what does this stuff actually look like that you're talking about? Well, here, and I'm sure most of us have seen this, this is a skewed image. Like I said, nowadays there's, de-skewing technology. This doesn't happen quite as much as it used to. Now, this is what they call noise, kind of a funny term, I know. But if there's a lot of noise, this is what you can see. You could see, and they also call it speckling, right? You can see those little dots in the background. Some of it's blurred, things like that. Obviously, this is a blurry image. You can still pretty much read this, so this might be kind of on the borderline between an A and a B error. But I would probably want to reject that one. Excuse me. Curvature. Okay, if you're doing volumes, like say you have these old tax assessment books, you can run into this problem where the pages curve like this. And sometimes you can read it okay. I've seen this a lot in my own research with microfilm and stuff like that too. So you want to make sure that what's in this curvature here near the spine is legible. This is why sometimes people will actually take the binding off of books and run them through a scanner so they don't have to do that. If you're going to, say, maybe even destroy the original books, you could do that, or you could have them rebound. A distorted image, you could see here how it, kind of curves down like that. Now, I'm not quite sure of the technical aspects here on the scan and what exactly causes that. But if you have a distorted image like that, and I would definitely say this is a Class A error. So finally, folks, so what do you do with images with errors? So if you're looking at something like going back to that ANSI AIM method, and it says, well, if you found one error in this batch, redo the entire batch. Well, what if there's 1,000 images in that batch? If this is really, by doing the sampling, that might be the only error there, or maybe there are a couple errors, you might just want to rescan that one. Technically, you should reject the whole batch and do it over again, but you might want to consider just redoing those images. And it's a good idea to keep a log or other record of all the images with errors as you go through. Now remember, when you scan, the software normally assigns some sort of unique indexing number that you can use to identify which images need to be corrected. So to sum all this up, and I hope this wasn't too confusing for you. I know for a lot of you, this is the first time you've probably been introduced to this subject. So, summary. So if you're destroying the original records after scanning, you must perform 100% verification. So if you're looking at this and saying, oh, geez, I really don't want to do this, then obviously you'd want to save the original record. The question you have to, excuse me, ask yourself here is, what is my storage situation like? So if you're scanning to both increase access to the records and to free up storage space because you desperately need it, obviously then you're going to want to dispose of the record and you have to do the 100% verification. If storage is not an issue for you, then at that point, you might just want to save the original records and then not have to do this. So what will happen then is your images will be for easy access and your paper will be for longer term preservation. So if you're maintaining the original records, right, so then this is when you could use the sampling methods much easier, right? Quality control and verification are a vital part of any digitization project. And I really want to emphasize this because like I said, a lot of times people do a good job on their prepping, their indexing, the actual scanning, but then they just either never get around to doing the quality control and verification, or they just do a very quick rush job to it. And it is really important, I need to stress that you take this part of a scanning project seriously, and for the reasons I just went over. So I believe, yes, we are down to the questions. Rich, I definitely see that we have some questions coming in here. I can see them on the chat.
Yes, yes, we sure do, Dave. Okay, going to start with a couple of comments we had. We had someone had sent a note who had a great deal of experience with projects involving a major New York State imaging vendor. And they noted that while you said the vendor can't verify the images, they know what you meant by that, but they said that part of what is paid for in the contract is that the vendor does verifications as they go along to make sure that they are doing it correctly or to the standard. But that said, the government or agency still has to do the verification. So I think they just wanted to clarify that, make sure people understood that part, that there's probably language in there to the vendor.
Yes, and I'm glad this person asked this question because now for those of you who have applied for grants, you can get grants from the New York State Archives to do imaging, and one of the requirements of the grant, if you're using State Archives money, is you have to explain how you're going to do your verification and quality control. And sometimes people say, oh, well, it's in the contract, we're paying the vendor to do this. But again, like I said, in the end, you really can't depend upon the vendor to do that. These are your records. If the vendor, say he's got lots of customers at this time, he really wants to move on, he could be doing a rush job. And that's not to disparage, any particular vendors out there. Many of them are very good and, honest people. But they're never going to care as much about your records as you are. And that's why in the end, you really have to do this. Now, to reiterate, it's like, yeah, they're going to be doing a certain amount of quality control and checking things. And usually after they've done some kind of batch, so maybe they just ran 300 records through the automatic document feeder, scanned them, they're going to quick go through. And oftentimes what they do is they have, thumbnail sketches that they look at quick and say, yeah, these look like quality images. And again, it's going to depend upon the vendor. It sounds like this person may have had some problems with the particular vendor they had used.
Okay, Dave, there's a question here from Yolanta. What's your recommended resolution, quality, contrast, etc., for scanning documents? Are there certain documents or quality of documents you would not recommend for scanning at all? So okay, it's a two-part question there.
Yeah, so looking at the guidelines, I can't remember off the top of my head, contrast and things like that. But for our guidelines say for basic, business documents, it's 300 ppi or pixels per inch. That used to be some years ago 200. It was increased because we noticed that 200 didn't always give people the best quality image that they should have. Now that's just for that, right? So if it's a photo, it may have a different setting. Oftentimes, if it's got a lot of small, tiny detail on there, like say a map or architectural drawings, sometimes they have a lot of little detail on there. And if you scan it at 300, it's not going to be sharp enough. So we always recommend to people they do some sample scanning to find out. Okay, so we notice 300 is not good enough, but 500 or 600 for a map seems to work well, and so we're going to scan it at that. So obviously, the higher that number, the better quality scan you get. But remember, the higher that number, the bigger the file. Okay, so you would need more and more storage space depending on how big that actual file is.
Okay, I have a question here from Daniel. Is it realistic to review 100% of the image documents, especially for records you do not have a lengthy retention requirement for?
Yeah, and that is something we've talked about, that perhaps if you're scanning records with a low retention period, we could just allow a sampling method. And sometimes it can become impractical. I know of one organization, I won't name them, but they oftentimes will scan over 10 million images per year. Now, obviously, they would have to hire like a small army of people to do verification. So in that case, they have to rely on some good sampling and whatever vendors they may be using. I'm not sure whether they do theirs mostly in-house or through vendors. So sometimes if you're getting into huge numbers like that, yes, the person asking the question is correct. It could become impractical. And like I said, there are some organizations that now use that ANSI AIM method in replacement of 100% verification. And like I said, that's something the archives may look at as we adjust those guidelines over the years, maybe depending upon how many you're doing in a year or something like that, you might have to use a sampling method. But that was an excellent question and a good point too.
And another comment here about from our experienced colleague, he mentioned doing imaging in batches needs to be specified in the contract. Vendors have a standard way that they do things. You kind of touched on this, Dave, but I think the point he wants to make here is if you want scheduling or regularity at a particular level in a particular way, get that cleared up on the front end and make sure that it all gets put into the RFP.
Yes, and that is an excellent point. And like I said, you may need to work with the vendor on this. And some vendors can do this easily. They have what's called FTP sites or file transfer protocol. Depending on how many images you're looking at, they could dump them just on a couple of flash drives. A lot of flash drives have pretty high capacity now. And they could, FedEx them to you once a week, something like that, and say, okay, here are the ones we did. Here's, a batch for the week out of your total project. So, I don't know how many you might be able to do in a week, and depending upon the vendor's schedule. And then you decide what your sampling method and sampling size you're going to use at that point. Or if you do decide you're going to do 100% verification, definitely work out some sort of system with the vendor where you can do this in batches and you're not just waiting to the end. But most vendors should be able to fairly easily accommodate you on this.
And a friend of ours suggested that we put the New York State Archives digital imaging guidelines, a link to that in this webinar, and I just sent that out to everybody. So.
Oh, great! Thanks for that.
Sure, and of course you can also just Google New York State Archives digital imaging guidelines, and we're the first hit that pops up in your Google search. Okay, Another question here from Yolanta. Can you please remind your definition of the batch? Would that be a group of documents bundled into a group of certain size or something else, like like maybe an hour worth of scanning, or how would you define batch?
Yeah, so it could be, Yolanda's right. Though usually I think what vendors do is as they scan a batch, depending upon the capacity of their automatic document feeder and their scanner, that small little batch, maybe it's a few hundred, they'll scan those and then they'll like I said, right after they scan them, do some quality control. But if you're looking at it, it could be a batch, could be ones they did daily, weekly, and again, depending upon how many you're doing. So if you're doing a huge amount, like that example I gave, I think was 430,000 images, for that particular project, in that case, you might want to do it daily, do daily batches at the end of the day. Again, have some system, an FTP site, some way that the vendor can get those images for the day to you, and then the very next day, as he's doing more scanning, you're checking that batch at the end of that day, and then et cetera, throughout the project. So by the time you get to the end of the project, any problems that you've had running through the project will have already been addressed and corrected.
Okay, I have a question from Sherry. Is it necessary to keep a log of records that are destroyed once you have completed 100% verification? She also remarks here, our records are permanent records, and I currently have a spreadsheet that lists the records and the date the original files were destroyed. So she asked, is it necessary to keep a log of records that are destroyed once you have completed 100%?
Yes, that's a good idea. And also, if this is going to be, let's say a policy for your government, you might want to put something like that in what's called an office retention schedule that you create for yourself. So it might say, let's see, I'll stick with payroll records since I've been using that as an example. Payroll records, scan after, let's say, 10 years, dispose of the original, right? So that's part of your retention scheduling process. And one popular question that pops up from people, so I'll answer it right now because it just popped into my head, is yes, once you scan a paper record, you can dispose of the original. Once you have, done your quality control and your verification that you have everything, you can legally then dispose of the record.
Okay, Anne also asks, can you speak a little bit more about indexing?
Yeah, sure. Now, and usually if you are hiring a vendor to do your scanning, they usually will do the indexing with that. Of course, you have to pay extra for the indexing. Because what you want to do, say, let me think of a good example here. Let's take vital records, birth, death, and marriage records. You're going to want them indexed somehow usually. That's the easiest way to find them. So you're going to want to do it by, last name, first name, perhaps date of birth, whatever access points or fields you want on there. And so what they do is they will index by whatever terms you ask them to index the record by. And then when you search for the record, obviously, you put in whatever search terms you need, and it pops up. In some cases, depending upon the type of document, you might want to use full text indexing. So that's just when they OCR or use optical character recognition. A little bit of a problem with optical character recognition. It's not always 100% perfect. So you could run into some errors there, and depending upon your search capabilities, might not be able to find something. So that's what we mean by indexing. Did that answer the question?
Let's see if I hear anything back from, that was from Anne. And also while I'm waiting, while we're waiting on that, Jean also asked, she says, has there been any word on awarding the grant applications that were submitted in January of 2020?
Good question. I was expecting that. No, unfortunately, we have still heard nothing. The state's been honestly kind of mum about it. And we're just as, maybe not quite as anxious as the grant applicants, but pretty anxious ourselves to start getting that money out to people so they can start their projects. And when we know something, we've promised people when we know something, we will let people know right away.
Okay, and Anne came back in and said yes, that answered her questions on, that's what she wanted to hear on indexing.
Ah, great.
Okay. And we got from James, you mentioned the fact that we can dispose of records once we scan/verify. I assume this doesn't apply to records associated with Medicaid billing. I think Medicaid has a record retention requirement.
Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head. That may be something that is addressed in the new LGS1 retention schedule. I've never heard of, and sometimes I've had people tell me, well, the comptroller says we can't save it as an image. We have to save the original paper. But then when we've talked to the comptroller's office, they say, well, that's not true. So honestly, I really don't know. But if you give Rich your email address, I could talk to the folks in our retention schedule unit, and we can get you, a better answer.
Sure. I was going to say, too, that, James, you could email me at arctrain@niced.gov, which is where you receive the instructions for the webinar. And we'll get that to Dave.
Yeah, because off the top of my head, I honestly don't know. I'm not familiar with that, so I don't want to pass along any erroneous information.
Well, at this point, I don't see any additional questions. We are approaching our 1 hour. Just here, Francine, she said, I had to walk away from my desk. Would you be able to send me the information regarding indexing that Dave explained? And I was just going to say, too, Francine, that this is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch this. But if you have any questions, again, please feel free to email us at arctrain, that's ARCHTRAIN, @niced.gov, and you can get your question to the right place. I've also sent out information earlier on if you're a local New York State government entity, then you can certainly reach out to your regional advisory officers. If you're with a state agency, you can email us as well. We'll get you in touch with state agency services. And that's looks like it's a wrap here, Dave.
Okay, great. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar and hope you got something out of it. And like I said, if you have further questions, just, let us know. We'll be happy to answer them.